History has shown us how one man's terrorist can become another man's statesman. Lenin, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Nelson Mandela have all made the long journey from wanted poster to national statesman. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, an international outcast for 20 years, was recently welcomed by French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Martin McGuinness once masterminded terror attacks as a commander of the IRA. He now dispenses advice on living in harmony to a divided Iraq. And it can work the other way. One-time Chilean President Augusto Pinochet was later arrested in London for illegal war tactics. Former Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic died in prison whilst answering charges of war crimes at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Israel's Menachem Begin made the full cycle from being pursued as a terrorist by the British to becoming Prime Minister 30 years later, and on to being accused of war crimes following Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Likewise, former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and other Israeli generals were pursued in the European courts for war crimes against the Lebanese and the Palestinian people. For their tactics during the war on terror, some are calling for America's own leaders to answer similar charges.
To round up our 2 hours of discussion about the war on terror and the violations of international law is with me once again Christopher Dickey and Michael Ratner, author of The Trial of Donald Rumsfeld. It sounded very much like the title of the trial of Henry Kissinger. Is there a parallel that you're trying to draw in the book?
You know, for a number of years, I've gone after tortures in countries all over the world, from Haiti to Guatemala. And all of a sudden, over the last 4, 5, 6 years, really since 9/11, we've seen the U.S., the Bush administration in particular, at its highest level, engaged in what I consider open and notorious torture of people around the world. And when I read the book around Kissinger, I saw that it had a real useful function because it brought to the public's attention that Kissinger had committed international crimes. In his case, both the bombing of Vietnam and torture. In the case of the trial of Donald Rumsfeld, that book particularly focuses on Rumsfeld and other high U.S. administration officials.
So let's talk about that for a minute.
Who set the stage.
Who are the plaintiffs and who are the defendants? Who are the accused and who are the accusers?
The plaintiffs, or what you would call them, the people trying to get the prosecutions, were victims of torture primarily, both in Guantanamo as well as in Iraq. There were also a variety of human rights organizations, etc., and those kinds of groups are allowed to bring prosecutions in places like Europe and France.
It's quite paradoxical, Christopher. There's been a number of people like what we were discussing earlier, like the Pinochet of the world and the Milosevic of the world, who were statesmen and ended up being criminal. While we also have seen a process where criminals or so-called terrorists ended up being statesmen, like the Mandelas and the Arafats. Do you see any realism in what Michael is saying about some people in Washington being held responsible?
I think it's an interesting exercise, and I think it draws attention to a place where attention needs to be drawn, which is the question of responsibility for the policies of the last 7 years. In that sense, it's very good. I mean, there was a line from President Bush in 2004, or at the end of 2004, that's always rankled me, where he said he was being interviewed and he was asked if he felt any regrets about going into Iraq at that point. And he said, I had my accountability moment. And that was the elections of 2004.
Not with God.
Not with God.
With the American people.
With the American people.
Right.
And my problem with what you're doing is that what's needed is an accountability moment with the American people. That's not just polls saying that the war is disapproved, but some kind of moment where the people, the government figures who are responsible for, in many ways, destroying the credibility, the fortune, and the future of the United States on these wasted foreign enterprises are actually held accountable, not by a political system that at this moment values celebrity over legality, but by the American legal system in some fashion.
Christopher, there is a dynamic between legal responsibility and political responsibility. And it seems that once you have a legal responsibility, it does open doors in terms of political response, because people react, especially in democracies, people react well to the legal system.
What's really needed in the United States, after the traumas of the last many years, is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. More than trials, we need a system that tells the truth, in which we come to terms with the kinds of things that have been done over the last 7 years. We're not even close to that.
The talk of the town nowadays is Bob Woodward's book, War Within. And I was struck by how much President Bush emphasized the need to win and need to kill the bastards and to kill the thugs and so on and so forth. There was so much emphasis in the need for blood, especially in places like Iraq. That kind of atmosphere, that kind of leadership, that actually emphasized so much the need to win by killing. I think that is the mindset.
Well, that is the mindset, unfortunately, but the American people are completely unprepared for that. The American people have not begun to understand that once Saddam Hussein was taken out, once Iraq was turned into a failed state, the United States created a dynamic where it has no alternative within the framework it's established for itself in national security, but to stay deeply, deeply embedded in the Middle East as the balance of power against Iran. We're not going to count on
What does that mean, deeply embedded? I mean, it means preemptive wars?
It means a huge military presence. It means
in the long term?
Over the long term. It's going to have to, the idea that the United States is going to turn around, everybody's just get on planes and fly back here and it's all going to be over, whether pulling out of Iraq or out of the region, is just wrong.
Because we talk about Middle East and Greater Middle East, what we're talking about, because Israel is not part of any American deployment. Actually, Americans cannot even deploy in the Middle East. So we're talking about the long war,
Really, you mean?
the war on terror, yes, in the Islamic world, in the Arab and Islamic world. That's it. There's nothing else there but the Arab and the Islamic world. So you want to deploy hundreds of thousands of soldiers, invade 2 countries, support proxy wars in 3, 4, 5 other countries, threaten Iran, Syria, and then expect not to be held accountable for violations of international law. I think that's an impossibility.
Well, of course. I mean, I don't know if Christopher wants to do this. I don't think he wants to do this. He's just saying that's probably what the U.S. is going to do. But I think when you occupy countries, particularly unwillingly, you're going to wind up torturing the populations. You're going to wind up abusing the population because
especially when the violation is vengeful.
Because it's vengeance. It's also sending, and I think I heard it on the earlier part of the show, it's sending a message of terror, in my view, to the Muslim world. You cross the United States, you will be sent to Guantanamo, you will be sent to Bagram, you will be tortured. And I think that's the way you occupy, and that's the way the French tried to occupy Algeria, and we see what happened during that war.
One of the reasons the French warned against doing this. I mean,
right,
part of the problem is, and I'm not sure that viewers around the rest of the world would understand this, Americans, certainly before Iraq, Americans had no understanding of the idea of occupation. They never understood how deeply it's resented. It's a hollow word, a meaningless word in the United States. And it's one of the things that made us incapable as a public of resisting the drive to go into Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Everybody agreed on that. He wanted weapons of mass destruction. There was no question about that. The danger that professionals pointed out was that it would lead to an occupation, and that would be disastrous for Iraq and disastrous for the occupiers.
You do argue,
but
Christopher, that America wants to stay there.
But the problem is that the United States has created a situation, and this is the problem of every occupation. This is the problem of Israel in the West Bank. Do the Israeli people want to stay in the West Bank and
Gaza?
So
it's the permanent war. Israel's called it the permanent war.
It creates a situation where you cannot imagine, as a question of security, you cannot imagine pulling out, partly because you've created so much hatred.
So perhaps
the idea is we can't stay. We have to stay until they love us.
I'm not.
That's never going to happen.
So you can't possibly believe that if they're never going to love us. I mean, my view is it's going to continue to exacerbate the situation the longer we stay in Iraq.
We're not arguing cross purposes here.
I didn't think so.
It will. I'm saying that the logic of the position is that you have to stay until they love you.
Or perhaps until people are held responsible for their violations, maybe war crimes.
Well, if you ever, there's judges in Europe who want to go after these guys for an aggressive war in Iraq because that's the supreme international crime. It's creating aggressive war. You go after them for that, and but of course there's not really the will and the power to do that right now.
I guess not. But with that, we're going to have to end the gentleman. Michael Ratner, thank you. Christopher Dickey, thank you. And thank you all for joining us.